everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our discussion. I've been really excited for this discussion as soon as I started talking to Michelle and Heige about it, because it's just such a fascinating topic. I'm Tara Gilboy, and I'm the author of the book Unwritten, which just won a 2020 Moonbeam Award, and then also the sequel, Rewritten, which are middle grade fantasy novels, which really has nothing to do with historical fiction. However, I am a huge fan of historical fiction. I love writing historical fiction. I am just not as good at it as Heige and Michelle are. But they're going to give us a wonderful, wonderful discussion today. Just to introduce Michelle and Heige. Michelle Barker is an author and editor who lives in Vancouver, BC. Her fiction, nonfiction, and poetry have been published in literary reviews around the world. A chapbook, Old Growth, Clear Cut, Poems of Heige, was published in 2012. The Beggar King, a YA fantasy novel, came out in 2013. And A Year of Borrowed Men, a historical picture book, was published in 2015 and was a finalist for the TD Canadian Children's Literature Award. Her young adult novel, The House of 1,000 Eyes, was named a Kirkus Best Book of 2018 and has won numerous awards, including the Amy Mathers Teen Book Award. Her newest YA novel, My Long List of Impossible Things, which I have right here and we'll be talking about, it was named the Junior Library Guild Gold Standard Selection. Michelle holds an MFA in Creative Writing from UBC and works as the senior editor at the Darling Axe. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Nice to see all of you.
And then Heige Boehm was born in Germany in 1964. Her writing is influenced by the stories of her parents who grew up under Nazi rule, particularly her mother's account and survival as a child in World War II and post-war Germany. Heige holds a creative writing certificate from the Writers' Studio of Simon Fraser University. She lives on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, where she is writing and researching her next novel. And I have her book right here, Secrets in the Shadows. Both of these books are wonderful. I definitely recommend you take a look at them if you have not. So I thought we would start a little bit. I know sometimes it's fun to get a peek at these books if you have not read them yet. And I thought we'd have Michelle and Heige read a little bit from each one, if you want. I'll just kind of introduce them a little bit to kind of let you know a little bit about what they are about. I think Michelle, I'll have you go first. My Long List of Impossible Things is a young adult novel set in Germany and begins just before World War II is ending. The main character is 16-year-old German girl named Katja, who lives with her mother and her sister. She dreams of being a concert pianist, but when the Soviets arrive in her town, her life is upended and the family has to flee. They're hoping to find shelter with distant relatives, but these people don't know they're coming, and the journey is dangerous and filled with violence. As the novel progresses, Katja has to find a way to rebuild her life after the war, and she also has to face some important questions about her country and everything she thought she knew about it. Michelle,
Okay.
I will turn over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to do a short reading from near the beginning of the book, and this is when Katja and her family have been ordered by the Soviets to leave, and they're now on the road. So that's where I'm going to read from. I think it's silly to go all the way to Pfahlhof, I said. Why can't we stay somewhere closer? Luckily, no one has asked for your opinion, Mutti said. So you will please keep it tucked in your pocket where it won't do any harm. Fine. I didn't want to think about Pfahlhof, some German city in the middle of who knew where. I knew where. A place I didn't want to go. Or Aunt Ilse, who anyway wasn't even our aunt and didn't know we were coming. Guess how happy she'd be to see us. 3 more mouths to feed and, who are you again? Distant relatives, which didn't count for much when there was no food anywhere and millions of people were wandering the countryside with nowhere to go. All the Aunt Ilses in the world must have cringed every time there was a knock at their door. Ilse will be relieved to know we're alive, Mutti said. She and I were very close when we were youngsters. We used to play piggy on the ladder together in the hayloft. Mutti, with her no-nonsense bun, her lips pursed, scrubbing milk churns or covered in flour. I couldn't imagine her as a little girl playing a game with string. She had talked to us often about Ilse, because Ilse and her husband owned a clothing shop. I was curious to meet someone whose idea of dressing up meant more than taking off her apron. Hilda wasn't just curious, she was thrilled. Will Aunt Ilse have Paris fashions? Will she let us borrow them, do you think? Stop making that face, I said. They're only clothes. I worried we wouldn't be fancy enough for Ilse, but that was a problem for tomorrow, Katja. Today, Katja had other things on her mind. You know what I really want, I said. Here we go, said Hilda. I want a wristwatch. I'd seen them on Soviet soldiers, their serious field uniforms with the fancy shoulder boards, their caps with the Red Star emblem, the rifles and tall black boots, and 5 ladies' wristwatches lined all the way up one arm. You need a wristwatch like a toad needs a waistcoat, Muddy said. A farmer works by the sun. When it rises, you get out of bed. End of story. A wristwatch is pure silliness. That's why I want one. Something dainty, so I could turn my arm and pretend to check the time while admiring the way it looked on my wrist. A farmer didn't wear a watch, but a concert pianist did. Perhaps a pocket watch, with a long gold chain disappearing into my pocket like a secret. It would tick against my chest like a second heartbeat. Not just 1, 2, 3 wristwatches, I said. I'd wear them all at once. I'd set one on Berlin time, one for London, and one for New York City. Dummkopf. Hilda's cheeks went red. We don't need to know what time it is anymore. What time is it? It's over. It's after. It's never. You don't need a wristwatch to tell you that. Just look around. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Oh, I remember reading that scene, but I've never heard you read it before. Heige, I'll have you read next, which I'm reading your book right now. I'm almost finished with it. It's so good. I'm so excited. So I will just to kind of introduce your book a little bit. Secrets in the Shadows tells the story of best friends Michael and Wolfie, who are caught up in the fanatical enthusiasm of the Third Reich's ideology in the 1930s. Their safe world turns upside down when Michael and Wolfie accidentally kill one of their own. When Michael turns 16 and his father orders him to volunteer with the Waffen-SS, Wolfie joins him. Assigned to the Hitlerjugend 12th SS Panzer Division, they cope with the horrors of war, trying to keep one another alive on the battlefields. Their lives unravel, and as one secret is exposed, another is born. When the final showdown begins, not only do they find themselves in Berlin with the Russians just blocks away, but Michael and Wolfie confront the secrets that lie in the shadows of their past.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to be reading 3 short parts, and the first part is the beginning of the book. I gazed into the butcher's window, and there, sandwiched between a goose and a sheep's head, my mirrored image stared back at me. I'm perfect, I told my reflection. I thrust my arm forward and clicked my heels. Heil Hitler. Frau Silberstein stepped out of the butcher's doorway. Michael, why are you saluting dead animals? Put your arm down before some sees. The next part is where Michael is 12 and he's with Wolfie, and they're on a train heading to Berlin, and Michael spotted a young girl named Rebecca, and he discovers later that she is Jewish, and a Sturmbannführer on the train realized that Rebecca and her mutti are Jews, and right at this part that I'll be reading, they're being hauled off the train, and Michael is horrified by what he's going to witness. At the next small village, the train stopped, and I stared out the window in horror as Rebecca and Frau Shapiro were dragged and kicked onto the train platform. The Sturmbannführer had Rebecca by the scruff of her neck now, and the 2 soldiers held onto her mutti. Wolfie and my other classmate pressed their faces into the windows to watch, and I rose to my feet, my mouth open in silent protest. Then I saw Rebecca struggle free and start running away, but the Sturmbannführer pulled out his Luger and shot her. She stumbled and fell and tried to get up. He shot her again. After that, she didn't move. All this time, Rebecca's mutti was screaming and struggling to get free to run to her daughter. The Sturmbannführer nodded to the soldiers to let her go. Then he shot her dead, too. The next part I'm going to read is Michael and Wolfie are in the Hitler Youth 12 SS Panzer Division, And they're in the Ardennes. It's nighttime and they're seeking shelter, and Michael is in charge of a bunch of other young soldier boys, the youngest being 14. The boys huddled together. I sat as close as I could to them, and although I knew the cold still ripped through their hardened young hearts, sleep captured them. A small glow from the fire danced over my comrades' faces as they slept. My head still throbbed and my throat burned. Distant shooting and bombing rang out through the night. But somehow the artillery fire felt soothing, and why not? I had grown so accustomed to it that I was just numb. After a while, our small fire burnt out, but the thunderous cracking of the war god's whip continued to rip across the sky, lighting it up in explosions of blues, orange, and yellows. The earth trembled beneath me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Like I said, I love both of your books so much. And I know you guys both were dealing with some really difficult subject matter. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about why you wrote your books. What kind of compelled you to tell these stories?
I'll go first. Well, my mother is German, and she grew up, she was a small child actually during Nazi Germany, and then was actually kicked out of her home by the Soviets and on the road to find shelter, and then ended up in what became East Germany. So I have for a while been very interested in her life and what she experienced. And I think one of the main reasons why is I want to be able to understand as best as I can, as best as anyone can, what it might have been like to live through those times and to make sense of them. And so that's really, that's the main motivation for a lot of the work that I do is to understand my mom's life and to understand that time in history that is just so awful and hard to fathom. And has so many echoes in our world now. I think it's very important, I think, for us to try to understand that time in history. So that's one of the main reasons why I wrote the book. But then as I was writing it, I also ended up sort of grappling with something I hadn't really expected, because a lot of the book is about what it means to be a hero. And I started thinking to myself, well, if I lived back then, what would I have done, and how would I have reacted? And of course, I think we all like to think that we would have been heroic in those times. But the more you read about it, and the more you put yourself in those situations, the less convinced you are of your own courage, I think, or at least I certainly was and am. I really had to call into question, who I am as a person and what I really would have done, because it's very hard. It's very hard to know when you really sort of put yourself against the wall and think about it. So yeah, it was an interesting process.
Yeah, my mom and my dad, they both were children as well. So it's a lot like your mom's story as well. Why I started writing the book was, one, I always wanted to be a writer, and a friend of mine, Stephen Mount, he was on an online writing community. And so he said, why don't you join? And so in that online community, writing community, I started writing poetry. And it was really the first time that I started to sort of explore my grief around my father. My father was murdered in 1983 in Texas. And so through this poem, I was able to put down the emotions and how I felt about that. And then that poem led to a short story. And somebody in that writing group had said, this would make a really interesting screenplay. And so years later, I took a screenwriting workshop, and I took that short story to turn it into a screenplay. And then in that class, I realized that I actually wanted to write a book about my father. And I sort of struggled a little bit at what point to start writing about Dad. And and so I thought, you know what, go back to him being a child, learn and understand what his life was like. And because I didn't know my dad's stories, I grew up hearing my mother's stories. And by sort of researching World War II, I got deeper and deeper into understanding what life might have been like for my mom and dad. And I always record my mother's stories, and they really helped me as well. And they had fled from the Russians as well. Yeah, so it really helped me to see what their lives were like. I got a deeper understanding and more compassion for my parents through that process. And it brought me a lot of peace, knowing, even though realizing that their lives were so incredibly difficult, it made me understand their behaviors and their actions about how they raised us and why. And I gained a better sense of self. So that's really why I sort of started writing this novel. I'm obsessed with the World War II now as well.
Yeah, it's hard to shake, isn't it? Once you get into it, it's like this. It's like an onion, you know. You sort of you take off one layer, and there's something interesting else that from a different angle or a different time period slightly, and then you pull another one off. It's like, oh, there's East Germany. You know, it's like it's endless.
Yeah, and I find that, you know, there's so many fascinating aspects about it. Just like you said, you know, how would I have responded? How would I deal with these circumstances? What kind of person would I have been? You know, and that's really interesting. And it was really hard. Like, I wanted to write about everything, and it was hard to sort of narrow it down to just keep it to this, because you're not writing a history book. You're writing fiction, and keep to that story. That was really interesting too, because there's so much. It's so fascinating, the war.
I think, you know, I think that's always one of the struggles of historical fiction, is getting down that research rabbit hole. You know, and it's interesting too, researching this as history, because, you know, I know, and especially with like younger generations, always seem to think, you know, like World War II and Nazi Germany was so far removed in the past, you know, but you guys both have very personal connections to it. It's not really that long ago in the grand scheme of things, you know, that these things happen. And I'm curious, like, did you guys, as you were researching and as you were writing your books, did you grapple with your connection to Nazi Germany's past?
I mean, I didn't really so much, because my mother was so young. You know, she was a very young child during that time, and completely innocent of what was going on. And her family didn't support Hitler. She's the youngest child of 5. There were 4 girls and a boy. And her father didn't want to fight in the war, and of course he didn't have a choice, and he spoke Russian, so they took him as a translator. But then her brother managed to stay out of everything until right near the end, where I guess that Hitler was basically rounding up anybody with a heartbeat, essentially, to come and fight. And he would have been too young to actually join the army. But my mom, it's something that she remembers very strongly. When they came, they found him. He was hiding, and she said they checked his teeth, you know, like he was a horse. And then they just basically dragged him away. And that's the last time she ever saw him, was when they were pulling him away to go and fight. So in that, like that, those are my connections to Nazi Germany. So it's not really a question of grappling with it. It's just, you know, a lot of sadness, because, you know, I didn't, of course, get to meet them, and you know, my mom lost them. And so, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I definitely did, because I grew up in Germany till I was almost 10 years old. And like I said, I always heard my mom talk about her experience during the war, but never my father. And where we lived, we would have army tanks at night go down the streets and across, and I would see these tanks, and I thought, you know, because of my mom's stories to me, I thought war was happening at night. I always thought, oh, war is going on. And so as a little kid, I would stay awake at night and think how I could stop that, because I had heard such horror stories of my mom that I knew war was bad and that it caused a lot of grief and pain. And when we moved to Canada, some of the first encounters in school, me and my sisters, we were called Nazis, Hitler, Jew killer, and I had never really heard any of that. And that was really the first time that I started to feel shame and guilt and being held responsible for the atrocities of my ancestors. And that really sort of started a long journey of feeling really bad about being German. And it wasn't, you know, while I was doing that research, I also, you know, realized, and taping my mom, that I was dealing with intergenerational trauma as well. And it wasn't until I read Hannah Arendt's book on responsibility, and in it she had written that the responsibility really is for the current government to undo the wrongs and the crimes of the past government. And that's when I realized that the guilt and shame that I was carrying wasn't mine to have, and in fact was doing a disservice, because the people that the responsibility is on the people that were responsible for the atrocities and of World War II. So I was able to really shed that and have some great conversations with Mom around that as well, because during one of the tapings she had said, what could I have done? And I realized, you know, she hadn't let go of that guilt or shame either. And so we had a great discussion about that. And I think that was the first time she had ever heard that she wasn't responsible for that.
Wow.
That's really powerful, because I know my mom carried that for a long time as well, like, because she immigrated to Canada and she was still in her 20s and quite young, and I mean, didn't speak any English when she got here, and she is very German looking. She's very blonde and blue-eyed, and she encountered a lot of that as well. People would sort of look at, whenever she would, you know, try to speak English, of course she had a very strong German accent, and people were not kind to her at all. And then she ended up marrying a Jewish man. And so I was raised Jewish and lived in the Jewish community. And I didn't understand this until like really quite recently, when we had a conversation about this, but she used to volunteer more than anybody at any of the things that were going on. She did more work than anybody I know. And I realize now, after, you know, talking to her, that I think she was trying to make up for something, you know, that she felt that she had some kind of a responsibility to right the wrong sort of thing in whatever way she could. And she also said that the Jewish community, I mean, and maybe this was just her perception or maybe it was real, but she felt that the Jewish community treated her in a slightly different way because they knew that she was German. And so I think she probably carried the same sorts of things that you did. And I mean, that has to be so hard, you know?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I didn't really realize it until, you know, how that made me feel. You know, if somebody would say something to me, I would, you know, slouch down and try to disappear. And it wasn't until, you know, I had a coworker, and every day she made some kind of derogatory comment towards me for being German, and she would think that was funny, and so she would laugh. And it was that constant being, you know, accosted in a sense verbally by this person, that I was able to sort of stand up and say, you know what, that's actually not okay for you to say those things to me. And I really started to own my feelings around that and give a voice to it. So even though it was really hard, you know, working for quite a long time with her and her doing that every day, it was really also a blessing in a sense, because I was able to confront it, and with that confront and acknowledge my own behavior around carrying that was really quite good.
It sounds like, 'cause from what you guys were saying about the process of writing the book and talking about the history, and, both of your, mothers kind of dealing with that as well. It sounds like it could almost be almost a healing experience to really start digging into that. I'm wondering, did writing your novel, and I think you already said, it really did inspire conversations with your family. But what kind of conversations, like what was the response? Have they read the novel? How do they feel about it?
Yeah, my mom hasn't read the novel. She says she can't because it just will bring up too much memories, and it's too painful. And I totally get that. And she's really proud that what I did. And so I still ask her the same questions. She still tells me those stories, but she tells them a bit with more clarity now. Before, she was almost robotic, and now she's got her feelings in that, which I think is really interesting. She acknowledges she was scared or angry, which she had never done that before. And one of my sisters, I was talking with her, and with her reading the novel, she realized that what mom and dad's life must have been like as young children, and she too gained a better understanding of who they were and why they were the way they were, because they were two parents who pretty much had post-traumatic stress, and they raised a whole family that way. And that was, I think, also healing for her. Another one was my youngest sister. I had a review done on my novel, and in it, on a subtitle, they had said that my father was a Nazi supporter. They got it wrong. They thought Michael's father in the book, the fictional character, was a supporter. And when I read that, I was really quite upset. And so I needed to talk to one of my sisters. And I told her what they had said, and I felt like I had done something wrong. And then, so we had a bit of a discussion, and then she called me back, and she was actually letting me know that she was really quite upset about that. And what happened for her was it triggered for her how we were treated and bullied as children in the early years of school. And for her, she thought she had dealt with it, but it reignited those emotions and feelings for her of being, verbally abused that way. And so that was kind of good to sort of have that discussion around that as well. So.
Yeah, no, my extended family has actually been very supportive of all the work that I've done around Germany. Unfortunately, with this book, like it literally came out like almost to the day that the pandemic hit. So, I mean, I didn't have a launch, and I didn't have the discussions around it the way I have with my other books, which is really too bad, because this one especially, centered around things that I think that our extended family could have talked a lot about. But my mom really loves the book, and I'm a little bit surprised, just because I feel like your mom, Heige, like it would, and she says that it brings back so many memories. And I thought, oh boy, like maybe those are memories you might not want to relive, Yeah. But yeah. She really, she liked the book a lot, and she found it, I guess it just brought back her life back then. I mean, again, like I feel like, oh geez, maybe don't want to remember that. But I've had only positive responses from my family, which has been really nice. So
I think too, by writing these stories, the novels for my parent, I think it sort of gave them a voice as well. It's like almost being witness to what happened to them, having some form of acknowledgement of what they endured, I think it did that for them, for sure.
I think that's absolutely true, because, I mean, I grew up listening to stories as well, but it's a little bit different when you actually delve into it. And I mean, when you write fiction, you are putting yourself into the shoes of these people and really almost experiencing it as close to firsthand as you can, right? Because you're dramatizing it and imagining it and putting yourself in that place. And I mean, it's the closest that I've ever been able to come, certainly to my mother, to understand, you know, who she is as a person now, based on all the things that she lived through, you know, not just during the war, but then afterwards in East Germany as well. So yeah, it's been a really interesting process.
Well, and some interesting points come up too, because like as you said, you know, you're both writing fiction, but it's based so much on your own personal family stories. And so I'm curious, and I know Heige, you had mentioned being upset when, you know, a reviewer had thought that character was, you know, based on your father. And so I'm curious where that line falls in each of your books. You know, what characters were there characters that were based on real people? Where's that balance between what's fiction and what is not?
Well, when I first started writing this book, I had thought that I was going to be writing like my mom's life story. And so it was going to be like almost, I mean, it was going to be fiction, but like based on a true story. And that went wrong really fast. It was not a good idea. So I had to back off, and then I started even worse. I started combining fiction and nonfiction and sort of creating a small explosions almost every day. And I thought, no, this is really not going to work. So I had to basically set the whole thing aside and start over again and make it almost completely fictional. But the one part that is directly inspired by what happened to my mom is when the Soviets actually arrived in northern Germany and came onto the farm and threw this family out of their house and stuff. That's almost exactly what happened to my mom. And she because she told me the story quite a few times, and she had a lot of details and interesting things that you would not have found in history books. And so it was very valuable for me to hear her story. And then I think also probably valuable for her to tell it, and you know, the cathartic, I think, probably, and as you've said already, a healing process for it. So but that's probably the only part that is really sort of directly from my mom's life. Although a couple of the characters, I used some of the things that my mom told me about one of her sisters and about her mom, and sort of used that as a launch, and then created fictional characters from that. So, because my mom actually has a sister named Hilda, and she used to tell me all sorts of stories about her, and I was so fast. I never got to meet her, unfortunately, but I was so fascinated by her that I thought, oh, she has to be in this book. And so, but I turned her into my own version of Hilda. So
she was one of my favorite characters. So.
I mean, mine too. Yeah. I liked her.
How about you, Heige?
Well, for me, I did include stories of some parts of my mom's story, but what I did was I used aspects of you know, my growing up as a child with the games that my sisters and I would play, like when the boys are playing Robin Hood, shooting arrows. That was really something that we would do as kids, the six of us. We would cut down tree branches and take the elastics out from our underpants and tie them to make bows and arrows. And then we would all run around the yard shooting each other with the arrows. And, you know, Mom would always be wondering where our elastics were from our underpants, because they'd always fall off because we didn't have them in there. So some of the my childhood memories with my sisters I put in there. And one of the stories that my mom told was when she had finished her apprenticeship, I think she was about 15 or 16, of becoming a chef in Germany. She had bought herself a pair of new shoes, and she was allowed to go on holidays with her friend to Thuringia. And she was swinging on a beam outside, and when she let go, she actually fell into a septic tank. Oh. And as she was falling, she was sinking into the vat of poo, and then she was screaming for her brother to come and rescue her. So he went and pulled her out, and then Mom had obviously lost her brand new shoes. And so I thought, well, that story has to go with Wolfie, because it was just so great, and it was fun. And then another one was in the novel I have two twins, the Yup twins, and that was a game my sister and I would always play as young children. We would pretend we were escaped convicts, and mom and dad were the jail keepers, and we would sneak into the house and steal potatoes and matches and dig a hole and cook the potatoes and sneak around. And so when I was writing the novel, I thought all of a sudden that just came back, and I thought, oh my God, I have to put these Yup twins in there. And both me and my sister, we had the same name, and so we were both called Yup, and it was just really fun to have those there. And all my sisters remember me and my younger sister playing that game, and so they just thought, oh my God, it's so nice to actually meet the Yup twins, you know, because like that was really quite great. But yeah, so there's aspects of the stories that are from my childhood and stories from my mom that I really enjoyed weaving through, because that's sort of a nice way of keeping family. It's almost like family mementos, and now they're forever in the novel, set in the novel, which is really fun to do that. And the funny thing was, my mom, when I first wrote the novel, she thought the whole thing was about her, and I guess she had tried reading a bit of it, and she goes, well, I don't see my name anywhere. How come I'm not in here? and same thing with my oldest sister. She thought the whole time, it's so cool that you wrote our family story. And it was like, it's not. So that was really good. Yeah.
I should have known when reading that scene that was too good to be made up. I mean, I would remember just reading that scene when they were drowning in the poop. There's no coming up with that, right? It's like
yeah.
I think, some of those stories too, it adds a little bit of levity too, because when you're dealing with such dark topics, especially you guys are both writing for young adults, you're writing like such dark topics. I think like throwing some of those little those moments in to add some of that levity can really help. Actually, that was one thing we haven't even talked about, and I'm curious about that because you guys are both writing for young adults. Like, what are some of the challenges of when you're writing for that audience as opposed to writing for an adult audience?
Well, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is that like you want to be true to history, but you don't want to traumatize your readers. And so you don't want to be sugarcoating, what actually happened, but at the same time, you don't want to give them nightmares. So, and I know for myself with, when you're dealing with post-war Germany and the invasion of the Soviets, you cannot write that story without writing about rape. And without writing about murder and violence and all of that, because it won't be a genuine reflection of what actually happened there. But at the same time, I mean, you want to be able to sell your books, right? And you want teens to come away maybe understanding what happened, but not, being completely freaked out. So I found that I had to tone things down. I had to change my ending also, because I had an ending that was a little bit darker than what it turned out to be. I remember giving it to the publisher, and the editor came back to me and she said, maybe we should just, make this a little bit of a happier ending than what you've got here. And I thought, okay, yeah, I guess I can concede that. But, and I think also adding humor, I tried to do a lot of that, especially between the sisters, which was tough because there's quite a traumatic event that happens right near the beginning of the book. And I had to try to balance what would have been a real emotional response to that with the fact that I wanted there to be humor between these sisters so that it wasn't just a dark tale from start to finish. I wanted there to be something like that. So that was actually probably one of the biggest challenges I had in the novel, because I needed them to be able to process their grief, but I didn't want this to be like a total downer the entire time. So I had to allow a bit of time to pass and then allow them to be able to joke around with each other again, at least to some extent. So just to sort of ease the darkness a little bit.
Yeah, for me, I actually didn't set out writing a young adult novel. I just wanted to write this story, and I want my character to represent my father, but I made Michael be a bit older in the story. And so I too really just wanted to depict the war the way the war is. I kind of think if you're ready to ask a question, you're ready to hear the answer. And I didn't want to sugarcoat it. I didn't want to soften it, and I didn't want to romanticize the war. I wanted it to actually feel gritty, you know, the real thing. That was really important to me, to have that. And when I had sent it away, it was my publisher that actually said this is a YA, and I sort of said, no, it's not. And he goes, yeah, it actually is, because of, you know, Michael is a teen. And so I had a few more sex scenes in there, and so he wanted me to take some of those out, and I thought, no, they need to be in there, because that's part of the war. Like you said, you know, rape was very common, and also kids having sex at a much earlier age. There was a different kind of maturity on some level, I think, as well. And so it was really important to me to keep it true. And I sort of actually struggled with putting humor in it, because the things that I found funny, people would go, that's not funny. And so my humor is a bit twisted in that sense, because I was like, oh my God, this is so funny. And they're like, no, this is really sad. So
the humor is a challenge in stories like that, because you want it to be there, but you have to be really careful sort of how you approach it.
Yeah. And I think, like, for me, the boys are naturally rambunctious, and my characters were a bit based on myself and my younger sister as well, and just sort of how we connected as kids, and we always sort of got into trouble. And there's a German book, Max and Moritz, and I grew up with that storybook, and it's about two rambunctious boys, and they always get into trouble. They steal chickens, and you know, they sort of hurt people along the way, and at the very end they fall into a batter, and the baker turns them into chicken feed. And so it sort of comes around, and as a kid I love that story. And so both Michael and Wolfie, in a sense, I thought, you know, it'd be really interesting to take those two characters and make them do things and have things happen to them, but a darker version of Max and Moritz, which was really interesting for me to do.
That was one of the things that I really liked about both of your books, is that your characters did feel so real and gritty, and it wasn't, you know, things weren't smoothed over. They didn't get too dark, but it felt you know, both gritty, and they were a product of their time. But also I think they were relatable to teens today. I guess, you know, and I love reading historical fiction, but I think sometimes there's like this misconception that, you know, that young adult readers aren't interested in historical fiction, that it's like too old-fashioned or too far removed from their own experiences. And I'm curious, how do you keep it relevant for your readers today? Because I think both of you were very successful at it, and I'm just curious what your strategies were for that.
For me, I think it's, you know, to try and get a reader to be able to feel the character through emotions, let them feel the emotions of the characters, because how we feel and how we respond, I think, is throughout the ages. It isn't just for now or in the 1800s. Love is love, hate is hate. And I think if you're able to make your characters feel authentic by having the right responses to situations, I think that can help draw the reader in and keep it current, and that's how they can relate to what's going on. And historical fiction, I think a lot of people like reading that because it teaches them about history instead of picking up a history book that can be quite dry to read. I think people learn history through historical fiction, and it's a great way of learning through it.
I sort of find that historical fiction just it keeps itself relevant because the questions are timeless. I mean, the sorts of things that you grapple with in Nazi Germany, we are still grappling with now, unfortunately. I mean, whether it's questions like what does it mean to be a hero, or things like, you know, what do you do if you have a leader who is acting in a way that is harmful and dangerous? I mean, what is your role as a citizen? What should you be doing? And what happens if you do nothing? You know, that because there's a cost to doing nothing as well. And so I feel like current events do it themselves. They keep historical fiction relevant. And the more I write historical fiction and the more I read about history, the more startling it becomes in terms of the similarities between the sorts of things that are going on right now. And for example, I mean, the book that I'm working on right now takes place before the Nazis come to power, and the circumstances and the situation and whatever, it's actually pretty unsettling to see, you know, how similar those times are to the times that we're in right now. But I think the other thing, though, that's also really interesting about historical fiction to me has only come through with the pandemic, because I've never really sort of thought of myself as being in the middle of a historic event, which of course we really all are now. And it makes you realize that when we look at history, usually we are looking at it with the benefit of hindsight. And we look at it and we think, oh, well, I mean, obviously this is what they should have done. And you know, this was so inevitable. And why didn't they see this? And why didn't they do that? But when you're in the middle of some big event, of course, you don't have the benefit of hindsight, and you can't really see what necessarily is inevitable or obvious. And you don't know how bad things are going to get, and you don't know how long it's going to last, and all of these things that, you know, we tend to forget. Like when World War II started, nobody would have thought that it would have gone on for 6 years and would have turned into what it turned into. I mean, even the Germans didn't think it was going to last that long. And so I think that, you know, a lot of what I'm realizing right now about the pandemic and about historical fiction is that the things that you think that are unthinkable can actually happen. And that's I think maybe one of the biggest and most important lessons of reading historical fiction is that we take a lot for granted, and we shouldn't. You know, a lot of the things that we have in place in our society right now are very fragile. And when you look at history and you see how easily these things can fall apart, you realize that they can very easily fall apart again. So it's just so important to read these things and to think about them and apply them to what we're in the middle of now.
Yeah, I when the pandemic first hit, I spoke to my mom, and she had said, you know, this isn't that bad. We suffered a lot more than what's going on, and I keep thinking, you know, when I go grocery shopping and there was hardly anything on the shelves, and I thought, but there's still food on the shelves. In World War II, they went through for 6 years and they didn't have food, and 8 years after the war, they didn't have food. They went hungry, and they had bombs dropped around them, and it does really put it into perspective of, you know, well, this isn't that bad. We still have food, we have shelter, we have the comfort, we're not having bombs dropped on us. But what was great for me was feeling that fear. And I thought, instead of it shutting me down, I thought, wow, I can really understand the kind of fear that the people would have had, and more so in World War II when they're escaping or, you know, just trying to survive. And so I used that fear and obviously amplified it for my next novel. And I thought it made me really be able to write more authentic, my characters. And so part of it is like, no, don't end right now, because I haven't gone through enough process yet. I need to feel more stressed out to understand.
Don't worry, it's all coming. But I had the same experience, like right in the beginning when I mean, I guess nobody knew what was coming, and we had all sort of shut our doors and shut our windows. I mean, part of it felt like a zombie apocalypse, but part of it also felt like and I had already finished my novel, and so I thought, oh well, I guess I don't have the benefit of what I'm experiencing now. But I really had that weird sort of feeling where I thought of my character, and I thought, like, they knew the Soviets were coming, and they knew that it was going to be bad, but they didn't really know what to expect exactly. And there was that sort of waiting, like you're almost holding your breath, and you know this thing is going to happen. And when the pandemic was just like, when we were all just sort of starting to hunker down, I thought, oh wow, like this must have been in a very small way what they must have felt when they knew that this terrible thing was coming, and they just didn't really know what it was. They didn't really know what to expect. They just knew it was going to be bad.
Yeah, and I think that the constant fear, that fear, like, I think, wow, we've been in this for 8 months, but they did 6 years of this continuous fear.
Yeah.
What does that do to you? And I think, even during the war, people got married, people died, they had funerals, they had birthdays, they celebrated, they cooked, life still continued on a certain level, and I thought, I don't have to be just freaked out. I can still do a lot of these things and enjoy moments and times that life really offers, and appreciate. And also, I really appreciate the people that I was able to connect with and socialize, with my partner, and just looking sort of at the relationships that I had and have. They became more sacred in a sense. And I think, during the war, people would have done that same thing. They really, all of a sudden, family was really, really important, and you tried to protect and your neighbors as well, and also it gave me an insight to people, the fear, the fear mongering around it. Which I think is really interesting when you feel fear, what you tend to do with that. You could see that,
Well, yeah. I think, because
teacher.
I think what you tend to do is to look for somebody to blame, right? And to scapegoat. And I feel like that's also something that, unfortunately is still with us, and something that is really worth thinking about and examining, because it hasn't really changed all that much. We're maybe just blaming somebody different now than we were blaming before, but it's still, when circumstances get really bad, I mean, governments tend to look for somebody to blame, because of course they don't want to be held responsible for what's going on, right? So they point the finger, and it's just such a dangerous thing to do, and it can lead to so many bad, I mean, as we saw with the Holocaust, it can lead to so many bad things.
Yeah, definitely. And it's always minority groups that get blamed, which I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because the minority group is like 1% or 2% or 5%. And yet that minority group, life is their fault. Like, all the bad things is because of the minority. It's really crazy when you're fed these lies, how people go for it and say, oh yes, it's because of that minority. That they're a minority. They can't do that. It's really terrible how that happens, and how people respond to it, choose to believe a false narrative, and not take responsibility for themselves, but always looking for scapegoats.
Yeah. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions. I know that people here probably have a lot of questions for you guys, and we're bumping up almost on our time. But so if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll go ahead and take a look. You can start typing them. But before we do questions, I just wanted to ask you guys quickly, what are you working on right now?
Well, I'm working on a couple of things, actually, and Tara, you actually know both of them. I have one novel for adults. It's a dystopian thriller set about 75 years or so in the future. that's based set in Canada after environmental catastrophe and all the wonderful things that I've imagined are going to happen in our world. And the other one is another Germany novel, and it's for teens, and it will be set just before the Nazis come to power. And that's the one I'm actually working on right now. The other one is sitting, resting. So.
You're really hitting these topics from both ways. You have the dystopian and the historical, and they're both dealing with these difficult times. And
it's amazing that I'm not completely depressed. I don't know.
You do it so well, though.
Yeah.
How about you, Heige? What are you working on?
I'm working on, I'm about halfway through a second novel about a secondary character from Seekers in the Shadows. And it's Paula, and she is going off to Ukraine where there's the Nazi killing fields. And that actually is really hard research, and I find it actually somewhat depressing. So I can only do it in smaller bits. And then the other one I'm working on is a screenplay that's about a serial killer. And that's actually really interesting. I'm enjoying working on that as well. So.
You got the uplifting topics as well. I'm sorry, I was laughing when you said a serial killer, just because it's like from the frying pan into the fire, you know. So
yeah, well, it's really fun because the serial killer takes place on the Sunshine Coast, and so some of my clients, I'm telling them about, and they're like, "Oh, no, don't put a serial killer here." Or my sister, she lives up here too, and so she was saying, "Well, where do they live?" And I go, "Oh, actually, right down your road." Like, no, you can't do that.
Oh my goodness. It's so funny because I was just laughing at Michelle when I was, saying, oh, you're getting it from both sides with these dark stories. And then you topped her, I think, with the series.
I think she did. I think she won that round.
I was actually working on a story with a killer in it too, and I kept talking about it, and people would look at me and go, "Wow, that was crazy." She keeps talking about. I'm like, but it's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, you sometimes shouldn't tell people what you're actually working on. You know, if you don't ever want to let them see your search history.
I know, right? It's like I sometimes I'll change it to like incognito mode just because I don't ever want that popping up, like when I'm typing my students on Zoom.
No.
We did oh, sorry, go ahead, Heige.
I once had to get my computer fixed, and I had to tell the guy, I'm really not a white supremacist. I just got a lot of Nazi stuff on here, and I'm not a bomber, because all the stuff I've been researching for it, right? And the guy just sort of looked at me like, okay, whatever.
Somewhere there's like a special list for writers that the government watches.
Exactly.
We did have some questions in the chat, though. Our first question is to Heige, and it is, who is that handsome guy on the wall behind you?
Well, I got several. One is my husband, one's my dad, and then that's my friend Steph over in the corner.
Oh, I think this question was from Steph, so that's probably the one he was referring to. Okay.
That's funny.
And Michelle, question for you. Can you share the original dark ending? Oh, I know what it is, but I won't say. And then, well, there's another question, but I'll ask you that one first.
Well, I mean, it will kind of ruin the story a little bit. Should I say it? It's a big spoiler.
That's up to you. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I won't, because it basically the end was I was going to have somebody die who I decided not to kill off in the end, and actually I'm quite a bit happier with the ending the way it turned out. When the editor first suggested, I thought, oh no, because I had always conceived of it in a certain way. And it's tough to change something like that. But then I thought, well, I'll try it, and I'll see what it feels like. And when I did it, I thought, oh, actually, no, she's right. It turned out a lot better. So yeah, so it was. I mean, as editors usually are, they're right, and I am.
They're always right. They're always right.
They're always right.
My editor is always right. I wonder if it's a writer thing. I have a character who I've killed like 4 or 5 different ways across 2 different books, the first book and the series. I killed his character so many ways, and she's still alive in both published books because my editor talked me back from the ledge, but I killed her a lot. And then we have another question. Did either of you use travel for research?
Oh, I did. I went to Germany, yeah, which was wonderful. And I, in fact, was supposed to go back again this fall, but that got canceled. But I did. I went back. I went to Berlin, and I went to the town where my mom lived after the war. And I still, one of my cousins still lived there, and she had actually spent all the years through East Germany there. So I talked to her for quite a while, and she took me on a tour, and we went around. I actually went to my grandmother's grave, and I went to a couple of the houses where my mom actually lived, and it was a wonderful experience. And I mean, because it was my first time in Germany as well, but being in Berlin too, it's a pretty amazing city, and to be able to sort of walk around. I mean, there's so much history there, and it's almost hard. I mean, I guess anywhere you go, I mean, I also went to Auschwitz, so that was another big experience. I mean, you stand in these places and you think, like, of the things that happened there. It's almost impossible to get your mind around, actually.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy, but that was a fantastic trip. Yeah.
I went back 10 years ago, and since then I've gone back 4 times. And being in Berlin, I had just started writing my novel, and we were walking down Kurfürstendammstrasse, and there was a church, the Kaiser Wilhelm Church, and it's just a memorial. And beside it, they built another church called the Lipstick. And they kept the main steeple of the church as a memorial. And so you're walking down the street, and all of a sudden you see this blown out steeple, and it literally transports you right back to the war. And when I saw that, I thought, oh gee, I need to have that in my novel. So that was really interesting. And then it's actually this, which was a coincidence, it's this steeple
Amazing.
that they still have that main part of that church in there. It was really fascinating to see it. And then another time I visited my cousin Elke in Dresden, and they took us to, they call it the Swiss Alps, and you hike around in Prina. And I had just written a part about Sonnenstein, which was a euthanasia center for the youth who were mentally challenged. And I didn't know that place still existed. And we had gone by, and I saw a sign that said Sonnenstein. And I said, oh my God, we have to go in there. And that, walking around the grounds and seeing that killing center, it really sort of threw me for about 6 months, and I had already put it in my novel. That was pretty surreal to see that, and I'm still upset about it. That, you know, what it represented. It was really quite disturbing. So, you know, I couldn't imagine going to Auschwitz and seeing that. It was
pretty. You know what? I mean, there were several horrible things, but one of the most horrible things was to see how big it was. You don't realize how it went on forever. I mean, you'd stand there and you couldn't see the end of it. And like, that was one of the most startling things of all. I never really realized how big it was, and it was huge. It was
interesting with the Sonnenstein, because the whole town was around it, and they had this huge cathedral. And I thought, how do you stay in your house and then see smoke, because they murdered them in the ovens, and there's this amazing cathedral, and on Sunday you go to church. It just, I couldn't fathom that. Like, it's so hard to get your head around that, you know. So those are good trips, and just talking to relatives about their experience, especially these German relatives. That was really fascinating as well.
There's another question for you, Michelle. This one, it says, I find it interesting that your German mom married a Jewish man. Is there any kind of dynamic with regard to both of their family heritages, or a feeling maybe of some kind of resolution, given that we were talking about how you both deal with your ancestry today?
I mean, I'm not sure how intentional it was that I think it just sort of happened. And I mean, to me, it does sort of symbolize a very nice resolution, actually. I think it's a good thing. And I feel like I'm really glad that I have both sides for myself. Like I lived in Jerusalem for a year as well. And I mean, I grew up Jewish. And so I have that part of me, but then I also, and not so much when I was growing up, but more so now, like really trying to honor my mom, because when I was growing up, she really, like, she never spoke German to us. And she sort of, I feel like she kind of set her Germanness aside, because as I'd already said, that, she was feeling, I think, discriminated against, and uncomfortable, and all the things, of course, you would feel as a German person in the Jewish community, even though she was a child during the war. So she didn't want to bring her Germanness to the family, I guess. And so I feel like now I'm trying to understand it and appreciate it and honor her and honor, what she lived through and stuff. And for me, that's been really important. So, and I like having both sides. I think it's been good. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but.
It does. No, it does. And a follow-up question, this one for both of you. Were either of your families in the post-war camp set up by the Soviets?
My uncle, he was caught and lived in the POW camp for about 5 years. And same with my grandfather. 5 years after the war, he came home, and they were both in POW camps.
I think that, I mean, I don't think that my mom ever knew what happened to her father. I think she thought that he was in a camp, but then they never heard from him. So I don't really know. I'm not sure.
Let's see. And then a question for Heige. Is the second book a continuation of the first story with regard to Wolfie and Michael, or does it deal with different characters, storylines, and another perspective?
It's Michael and Wolfie keep wanting to come into this novel, and I keep saying, you had your turn, it's time for somebody else. It's about Paula, Michael's sister, and she's a nurse, and she goes off to the Ukraine, and yeah, so there's a whole bunch of new characters. And what's really fun about writing this novel is we learn more about Michael's life, because as in any family, we can be in the same situation, have the same things happen, but we all take a different view of that, our accounts of that. So it's been really fun writing it from a female perspective. And I had a really easy time writing Michael and Wolfie from a male perspective. I'm having a much harder time writing from a female perspective.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. That's what I thought too. I struggle because the one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to stereotype females. So that's been a real struggle. And it's lovely. My girlfriend Karen, I'll call her up and we'll have these discussions around it. And it's interesting because, like, how much does that have to do with my own upbringing through media, or what I think a woman should be? And because I really don't want that. I want it to be an authentic voice. And so I keep stereotyping her, and she keeps saying that's not who I am. So it's really challenging myself and my own perception of myself, of what I'm putting out there as well. So it's a good struggle because you grow and you learn from them. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
That brings me to our next question when we talk about good things. And maybe this will be, I know we're running up against the time. So this actually might be a good place to end, because I like this question a lot. What do you enjoy most about your writing?
Ooh, I love writing a first draft. First draft is my is the best. I wish I could only write first drafts. Unfortunately, that is not the way this works. So yeah, because I mean, just having the daily word count, because I have learned from my mistakes. And I think my books out before I sit down to write them. So I usually have a pretty solid plan in place before I start writing. Not scene by scene or anything, because that would take a lot of fun out of it. But just thinking through the story from start to finish, and not allowing myself to take shortcuts, which I have tried to do in the past, and it's backfired on me terribly. So yeah, just the daily habit of sitting down, and I've got my, however, usually it's 1,000 or 2,000 words that I want to do per day, and going through it. And yeah, that is the best part of being a writer. I just love it. So it's unfortunately not like that every day.
It's good that you have a favorite, because when I'm revising, I think that first drafts are my favorite. And when I'm writing first drafts, I think that revisions are my favorite. So I'm just never happy. How about you, Heige? What's your favorite part about writing?
For me, about writing is developing the characters. I love pushing them. I like seeing how far can I push a character before he breaks or they break. What happens once I do break them? Who do they become? I really enjoy going through that experience with them, for sure. I don't plot my stories. I see them from beginning, middle, and end within like a really short period of time, and I don't know what's going to happen in between. And that, I think, is one of the things that I really enjoy, is having the characters tell me who they are and what they're doing and what they want to have happen. Basically, they're telling me their life, and I get to record that. That's sort of how I feel. And so I really love being in that flow. It's almost like you're in a trance and you're just recording what the characters are saying. And again, my favorite part is seeing how far I can push my characters to the brink and what they will do. That I really enjoy that.
Well, that's lovely. Well, thank you so much for giving us this peek into your creative process and your family histories and just this whole process of writing these amazing books. If you guys have not read them yet, I do encourage you to get copies, because they are both amazing. So this has been fascinating for me. I felt like I was the audience and not even leading this discussion, because I'm hanging on your every word. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And thank you guys all.
Thank you guys for coming. Yeah.
Yes,
thank you. And Tara, thank you for moderating, and Orla, thank you for being here. And yeah, this has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tara. I loved every moment. All your questions were wonderful. Thank you for doing what you did. And Michelle, thank you. And Orla, thanks for organizing this. And thanks to you guys in the audience.
Yes.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.